Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to commence today's programming. I don't know if the doors should be shut or not, but... Well, thank you so much for being here, and welcome to the 2024 ACO Toronto Symposium on Intangible Heritage. I'm Alessandro Tersini. I'm a cultural writer and a board member at the Architectural Conservancy of Ontario's Toronto branch, and I'll be your MC for today. On behalf of the board, we're very excited to explore the complex and nuanced topic of intangible heritage with all of you, and to have such an amazing group of speakers here today to lead that charge. I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge that we're meeting on the traditional territory of many First Nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. I think the intent of land acknowledgements is about many things, and perhaps one of those things is the importance of recognizing intangible heritage. Before we get started with exploring some of the other ways that we can recognize intangible heritage, let's quickly attend to a little bit of housekeeping. First and foremost, we have some unfortunate news that a couple of our speakers took ill this morning and were unable to join us today. Chi Tam and Dane Williams both could not make it, sadly. So what we've done is a little reshuffle of the panels, and instead of having two consecutive panels of three, we're going to have just one panel of four speakers with both the moderators, who are both absolutely fantastic. So it's going to be a great group of 6 people, and you'll get out a little early, get some drinks from the bar, and go sit outside in the beautiful sun. The bathrooms are located, I guess, stage right to the left of the auditorium, just there. And we're recording today's session and streaming it live to our online attendees. And that video will be available on ACO Toronto's YouTube channel after the fact. I'd also like to say huge thanks to our main sponsor, ERA Architects, and our other sponsors, GBCA Architects and Catherine Naismith Architect, for their generous contributions which made this event possible. And a big thanks to CECIL Community Center for hosting us. We chose this venue because it straddles 2 neighborhoods that are thought of as having intangible heritage value: Kensington Market across the street over Spadina, and Chinatown, Spadina. So this event is organized, as I said, by the ACO Toronto branch. The Architectural Conservancy of Ontario is a registered charitable organization and one of Canada's largest heritage nonprofits. For 91 years, we've protected, documented, and conserved culturally and historically significant sites throughout the province and created educational programming that makes that heritage more accessible. One of 15 local ACO branches across Ontario, ACO Toronto achieves this through enterprises like TO Built, our free public database of over 15,000 buildings, structures, and human-made heritage landscapes across the city. We work to inform and stimulate discourses about built and intangible heritage and advocate for its recognition and stewardship. And to that end, every year ACO Toronto hosts a symposium exploring current heritage ideas. Past themes have included housing and heritage, which was last year, Main Streets, Modernist Schools, and Demolition. Today we're examining the phenomenon of intangible heritage, or heritage that is distinct from built form. So what is intangible heritage? If you look at your little programs, there's a little write-up that I did that tried to get at this idea, and I'll just read it out so we can all kind of mull it over, which is: intangible heritage can relate to traditions, activities, commerce, communities, identities, and storytelling. There's a sense in which all heritage has intangible elements. While it certainly has relationships with physical spaces, what makes intangible heritage different from built heritage is that its significance lies outside of traditional evaluations of architectural merit. It is use, not aesthetics, that defines intangible heritage. Or is it? The narratives of intangible heritage are complex, intersectional, and in motion. Looking more closely at its presence across Toronto, from Kensington Market to Little Jamaica to suburban banquet halls, today's speakers will highlight some of the things the term intangible heritage can mean and should mean, and why. But before they do that, I thought it would be helpful and a little bit fun to take a look at language. So let's see what some of our favorite dictionaries have to say about the word intangible. If we look at the online etymological dictionary, it dates the sense of intangible as something that is incapable of being touched to the 1630s, and the more figurative sense of intangible things as those things that cannot be grasped by the mind from the 1880s, which is much more recently. The most recent, specifically Canadian dictionary, the Gage Canadian Concise Dictionary, which happens to be from 2002, gives more or less the same two definitions, and you guys might recognize that cover. The Cambridge Dictionary goes a little bit farther and says that intangible things are things that it's hard to give an exact value to. Collins defines intangible things as things that are hard to measure. And our good old American friends, in a sort of roundabout way, go the farthest, I would say, and categorize intangible things as things that are incapable of being appraised at an actual or approximate value. So basically, like things that can't be listed on NASDAQ. In terms of thinking about how to start this conversation, this quote by Ian Gormley in the Toronto Star a few months ago really stood out to me as a helpful distinction in terms of tangible and intangible heritage, the ways that we're used to thinking about those terms, which is we're very good at preserving neon signs and old facades, but very bad at maintaining the activities that functioned under their glow behind their walls. So let's get into it. As I say, a bit of a shuffle with the panels. The way it's going to work is we'll have our now 4 presenters present consecutively at this podium. Some of them have slide aids, and then they'll go back into the auditorium so they can see their colleagues' presentations. And then when all 4 are done, the 4 panelists and the 2 moderators will all assemble on stage, and they'll have a conversation. And I estimate that the entire panel will probably conclude around 3:30. So it's my pleasure to introduce our 4 speakers. First up, Lisa Prosper is a cultural heritage consultant whose work includes projects related to the identification, commemoration, and conservation of cultural heritage landscapes and other forms of place-based heritage with First Nations communities, all levels of government, the private sector, and heritage organizations including UNESCO, ICOMOS, the Historic Sites and Monuments Board of Canada, and Canada Council. She currently chairs the Indigenous Cultural Heritage Advisory Council at Parks Canada. Lisa is a member of the Acadia First Nation and lives in Whitehorse, Yukon. Sneha Mantin is an urban planner, urban designer, and architect whose work examines the relationship between physical places and cultural activity. Having recently completed her PhD at the University of Toronto's Department of Geography and Planning, congratulations, and being a Connaught PhDs for Public Impact Fellow, Sneha's research centers on banquet hall sites in Toronto's suburbs and their cultural and intangible heritage significance for immigrant, newcomer, and diasporic communities. She recently produced and curated the crowdsourced exhibit, Banquets and Belonging, Diasporic Celebrations in the Greater Toronto Area, at Peel Region Art Gallery, Museum, and Archives. Nicholas Jennings is a music historian, journalist, and author based in Toronto. He was the music critic at Maclean's from 1980 to 2000 and has contributed to the Toronto Star, the Globe and Mail, Saturday Night, Billboard, Words and Music, TV Guide, Inside Entertainment, and Hello. Nicholas's books include 50 Years of Music, the story of EMI Music Canada, Lightfoot, and Before the Gold Rush, Flashbacks to the Dawn of the Canadian Sound, a history of the 1960s Yorkville era of Canadian music. That sounds fascinating. I'm really excited to hear about that one. He is currently a co-curator of the Friars Music Museum, celebrating the rich musical legacy of Toronto's Yonge Street. Our 4th speaker is Michael McClelland. He's an author, architect, founding principal at ERA Architects, whose work blends heritage conservation, cultural planning, and urban design. Michael has worked on heritage sites across Toronto and beyond, including the Distillery District, Evergreen Brickworks, the TD Centre, Mirvish Village, the Royal Ontario Museum, Union Station, and the Art Gallery of Ontario. His books include Concrete Toronto, a guidebook to concrete architecture from the 50s to the 70s, and The Ward Uncovered, the archaeology of everyday life. Stimulating their conversation and deftly moderating different strains of thought are our two moderators. The first is Stefan Novakovic. Stefan is a writer and senior editor at Azure Magazine, a former editor at Urban Toronto, Canadian architect, Canadian interiors and buildings. Stefan has written extensively on architecture, urbanism, design, and the ways in which they engender and are shaped by a diverse range of discourses. He has been a speaker at the Interior Design Show, the Architect at Work Conference, the Architecture and Design Film Festival, and more. And the second moderator is Michael Acci. Michael is an architect and at ERA Architects, whose practice explores the hermeneutics of space, the translation of historic architectural styles in contemporary settings, and inclusionary approaches to heritage sites. Michael holds a PhD in architecture from the University of Liverpool, where his work explored the filmmaking as a documentary tool to capture cities, narratives, and the role of the body in challenging the constraints of urban space, including through the practice of parkour. So we'll start with Lisa, if you'd like to come up to the stage, and I'll help people know what order to go in, but it's generally that order, I would say.
My name is Lisa Prosper, and I've been working in the field of heritage for over 15 years. For the past 10 years, I have been a consultant working with public and private sector clients on a wide range of different projects. I've worked on heritage studies, master plans, design proposals, interpretation strategies for a diverse array of sites in major cities in Canada and abroad, as well as remote sites in the Yukon. I have also played advisory roles on heritage policy to the federal government and international organizations. I am Mi'kmaq on my father's side and a member of the Acadia First Nation in Nova Scotia. On many projects, one of my roles is to bring an Indigenous perspective to both the process and the deliverable. Just going to pause a moment. I'm getting waved at the back. Closer to my, to them. Okay. Perfect. I will start this presentation by reflecting on the notion of intangible heritage as it relates to Indigenous heritage in Canada. I will then transition to talking about Indigenous perspectives on heritage and how they can inform conservation of place-based heritage. The traditional focus of the heritage field has long been the commemoration and conservation of tangible or material heritage that reflects historic periods, events, or architectural styles that are deemed notable. In more recent decades, there has been, as we all know, a growing focus on intangible heritage. Broadly speaking, this has achieved several things from my perspective. First, it has drawn attention to the meanings and values associated with or attributed to tangible heritage by different constituents. This in turn opens the door to multiple intersecting or competing narratives on a given heritage site, structure, or artifact. I think this is an extremely important development and one that invites us to look at material heritage from many different angles. I've done a number of projects in and around Dawson City, Yukon in recent years. Not surprisingly, the extensive tangible heritage associated with the Klondike Gold Rush in this part of Canada tells a very different story from an Indigenous perspective than it does from the perspective of settler communities. The recent designation of the Klondike World Heritage Site, pictured here, offered the opportunity to tell a more complex and nuanced story of gold rush sites in the Dawson area. A story that focuses on the Indigenous experience of colonialism and the intersection between Indigenous peoples and newcomers during one of Canada's most iconic historic periods. Second, the growing focus on intangible heritage draws attention to tangible heritage that may not be remarkable in its own right, but which may hold deep-rooted significance to one or more communities because of its associations or uses. I think it has served to foreground the fact that some of the most compelling sites out there lack monumental qualities, but are no less worthy of commemoration and conservation as a result. And third, it has garnered attention and resources toward the conservation of wholly intangible forms of heritage. From an Indigenous perspective, this has been significant given the rich body of Indigenous cultural heritage that lacks the sort of intangible expressions that were previously the mainstay of the heritage field. However, despite these positive contributions to heritage discourse and practice, I'd argue that the concept of intangible heritage, both its origin and the way it is often interpreted and applied, is still very much predicated on material heritage as the thing in relation to which intangible heritage holds together as a concept. Personally, I find that creating a fundamental or categorical distinction between tangible and intangible heritage rather misses the point in an Indigenous context. Mind you, the same goes for other binary typologies that characterize the heritage field: culture versus nature, relic versus living, movable and immovable. These distinctions and the assumptions that underlie them emerged in a different cultural context, so it is not surprising that arguably they are not the best fit for an Indigenous perspective on heritage. Indigenous cultural heritage, when considered on its own terms, is not straightforward or perhaps even appropriate to define. Generally, the impulse to define or categorize Indigenous heritage is driven by external needs, the desire to create a framework for Indigenous heritage that the heritage field can work with. Excuse me. It should go without stating at this point that Indigenous peoples are custodians of their own heritage and free to understand and steward it as they see fit. This goes to the core of Articles 11 to 13 of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. These articles speak to the right of Indigenous peoples to, quote, maintain, protect, and develop past, present, and future manifestations of their cultures. A key step in this regard is not having to conform to concepts and ideas that were developed in different cultural contexts. In a broad sense, Indigenous cultural heritage is an interconnected systems of relationships, beliefs, knowledge, practices, and traditions that shape identities and worldviews. We are talking about a living heritage that finds expression in many different forms: oral narratives, teachings, protocols, gathering, skills, art, culturally significant places, travel routes, seasonal activities, language, and yes, things of different shapes, sizes, and functions. An important theme that underscores Indigenous heritage is an integral and nurturing relationship to land. Relationships to traditional lands provide a foundation for Indigenous cultures and identities and are therefore a good starting point for working with Indigenous peoples. For this reason, I tend to adopt a cultural landscape lens in relation to Indigenous heritage that focuses on how relationships to the land are expressed and revitalized over time and space. So what does all this mean in relation to project work? Well, that obviously depends on the project and its context. Projects driven by Indigenous communities with the goal of commemorating, conserving, and perpetuating their own heritage offer many opportunities for exploring what communities value most as heritage and what they see their stewardship role to be. However, for what remains of this presentation, I'd like to focus on more on how Indigenous heritage and perspectives on heritage can inform the design and restoration of urban spaces. Many projects I work on relate to urban sites, such as buildings, neighborhoods or districts, green spaces, infrastructure or new build sites that have little obvious connection to Indigenous peoples, beyond the fact that they are located in a traditional territory. As a result, the default can be to acknowledge that Indigenous life in the area predates the site, and then focus on analyzing the physical attributes of the site, their historical associations, and the resulting values. However, adopting a cultural landscape approach to Indigenous heritage as it relates to urban spaces can open the door to many opportunities, not only for recognizing and perpetuating Indigenous heritage, but also for enhancing the qualities and experiential value of urban spaces for everyone. What we're looking at here is the Ottawa River and downtown Ottawa. And this learning through various projects in the area is a very important part of the river for the Algonquin Anishinaabe, mainly because it's at the confluence of 3 separate rivers and was traditionally a site of meeting and inhabitation and trade. The cultural landscape approach I am referring to involves looking within and beyond site boundaries to better understand Indigenous relationships to the area in question and how it is expressed in different forms. A number of general questions are relevant to this approach. Are there culturally important places in the area based on Indigenous use or associations, either past or present? Are there Indigenous stories or narratives that relate to these lands? Are there Indigenous place names in the area? How are the natural and cultural components of the landscape described in Indigenous languages? What knowledge, skills, or teachings reflect Indigenous life in the area? How do Indigenous peoples see themselves in this place, in the past, present, and future? What opportunities does this provide for cultural revitalization? And are there Indigenous cultural values that can guide the core concepts of the project? These are just some of the questions that can help us engage with Indigenous heritage in a manner that can shape the design or restoration of urban sites. Clearly, engagement with Indigenous communities and experts is an integral part of this approach, and it is often the most challenging part for several reasons I have observed. Project timelines often do not allow for substantive engagement, or the engagement begins too late during the project cycle to meaningfully inform the work. Many Indigenous communities are suffering from consultation fatigue and may not have the resources or interest in participating, particularly if past engagement has been unsatisfying for any number of reasons. And engagement, however well-intentioned, is often conducted from the perspective of how the Indigenous community can contribute to the project, rather than how the project can contribute to the Indigenous community. These are just some of the more common challenges of engagement on heritage matters. To address these challenges, I think a few strategies are relevant. The first is essentially to do the basics right, start engagement early, and allow it to inform the trajectory of the project. Ask open-ended questions and provide several opportunities for participation during the project cycle. Hardly earth-shattering stuff, but in my experience, poor engagement practices are the main barrier to meaningfully addressing Indigenous heritage and perspectives on heritage and project work. The second is to adopt a fluid conception of heritage and create space for Indigenous participants to speak to what is important to them, free from restrictive definitions or categories. And third, it can be helpful to present projects as an opportunity for collaboration that Indigenous peoples can shape in function of their own needs and ambitions with respect to heritage conservation. Indigenous conceptions of heritage are often present and future-centered and informed by the desire to keep culture alive by passing it on to younger generations. As such, framing projects as an opportunity in this regard can resonate well with communities. A few concluding thoughts. First, I would say I think it's important for Indigenous heritage to be understood on its own terms. While the notion of intangible heritage has certainly helped draw more attention to Indigenous heritage within the heritage field, it also implies a taxonomical way of looking at the world that does not come from an Indigenous context. In addition, as I've tried to explain, I think Indigenous relationships to land is a useful starting point for identifying and conserving place-based heritage. Understanding these relationships and how they are expressed often requires looking beyond site boundaries, being open to creative ways of drawing lines of continuity, past and present, that do not rely primarily on the conservation of material form. And lastly, I would argue that Indigenous perspectives on heritage are not only relevant to identifying culturally appropriate ways of commemorating and perpetuating Indigenous heritage, they also offer a useful way of looking at heritage practice more generally, one that encourages practitioners to assess the merits and shortcomings of established frameworks and categories vis-a-vis non-Indigenous heritage. I would argue that the cultural landscape approach I described is equally productive in non-Indigenous contexts. Wilaliuk. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lisa. Let's do a little switch over of the slides. And please join me in welcoming Sneha Mantan.
Hi, everyone. My name is Sneha, and as Alessandro mentioned, I very recently finished my PhD in planning at the University of Toronto, and for my research, I focused on identifying the gap that exists between how immigrant racialized communities, and I particularly worked with South Asian communities in the GTA, particularly Toronto, Brampton, and Mississauga, the gap that exists between the spaces that they use for their cultural activities and the way in which heritage and cultural planning is kind of done at a municipal level. And so today for this presentation, I'm going to kind of be focusing on the case study of banquet halls as sites of intangible living heritage for South Asian communities in Toronto, Brampton, and Mississauga. And for me, I came to the idea of intangible heritage almost as a shorthand, as a way to explain some of the things that I was finding in terms of the cultural value of these spaces that I was finding it hard to articulate myself. And so because of that, a lot of my presentation today, I'm just going to be sharing stories of these spaces because in some ways it's really impossible for me to encapsulate the intangible value that these spaces hold for the communities that they're important to. So I wanted to start with this photo because this is actually from my first event at a banquet hall. This is from 2016. This is before I even lived in the GTA. My parents are in the middle of the photo. It's from a wedding event from my sister and brother-in-law's wedding. It was held at Dreams Convention Center in Mississauga. I was just a guest at this event. I grew up going to banquet halls for different kinds of events. So for me, it was such a normal part of my upbringing that I didn't really think much about it then. And then many years later, when I started doing my PhD research, one of the first things I did was, because I was doing it during COVID, I got on the phone with a bunch of members of the South Asian diaspora and just started asking them how they spent their time pre-COVID on their weekends, on their weekdays. And to Lisa's point, the engagement part, the questions I was asking were really important because I didn't start off asking, what are the sites that are important for you for your heritage practices? I just started off by asking, how did you spend your weekends? And I specifically remember one conversation with Poonam, who was a second-generation South Asian living in Mississauga with her parents, and she shared how before the pandemic, she went to at least 10 to 15 events in banquet halls every single summer growing up. In her words, I remember just being in banquet halls, like an entire summer would just be spent in banquet halls with family and friends and food. She shared her memories of dancing from early in the evening to late into the night. And for her, these spaces really did remind her of her traditions, her culture, her upbringing. And during the conversation, because it was COVID and a lot of these facilities were closed for an extended period of time, she kind of lamented how her younger nieces and nephews were not going to be able to participate in those practices in the same way. In the GTA, a lot of these banquet halls are located in what are termed areas of employment, which are essentially zones that are dedicated to industrial and commercial uses. And this is primarily because this is the only place where affordable larger parcels of land that are close to highway infrastructure are available. And there are new provincial policies, so for example, Bill 97, which actually affects how these areas are zoned and used, and Bill 23, which affects how heritage can be designated. All of these are kind of putting the future existence of these spaces, many of which actually did end up closing due to the pandemic, they're putting their future at risk. So this was the kind of larger context within which I was doing this research, and so for me it was really important to understand and document the kinds of cultural uses, operations of these spaces. So one of the things that I did was I visited a bunch of banquet hall spaces and interviewed the owners and operators, many of whom themselves belong to the South Asian diaspora and are essentially just ethnic entrepreneurs, their family businesses. And these spaces architecturally are not significant. So as you can see in this picture, they sit amongst these industrial buildings, concrete, 1 to 2 storied, with a little bit of landscaping, sometimes unintentional. And this particular banquet hall is run by Osai, who's an Afghani woman, and it's owned by her husband Raghib's family since 2015. Osai and Raghib actually got married at this very banquet hall in 2014 when it was under a previous owner. And so because it's been in the industry for 14 to 18 years, this banquet hall has sort of established a word of mouth kind of way in which clients find them. So when I asked them, how do people find you? They were like, we don't do any advertising. A lot of times we get people coming in saying, oh, my uncle got married here, or my sister got married here. So there is a very strong intergenerational connection that these spaces have for people in the community. While a large proportion of their clients are South Asian, they cater to a very wide variety of audiences. So when I was interviewing Osai in the summer of 2022, they were in the midst of hosting events catering to the Eritrean, the Guyanese, Trinidadian, Nigerian, and these are just some examples. There's a lot of different ethnocultural communities that these spaces serve. Osai and Raghib, along with their staff, hold a lot of deep cultural knowledge about the event-based practices of various subcultural groups that they serve. So for example, they both shared how for their Muslim clientele, they make sure they have halal meat, they have spaces separate for men and women if that's required, and they have a very deep knowledge of like the prayer times that are on a daily basis, and they have in-house prayer mats that they lay out during those prayer times for those events. Raghib, who is responsible for meeting and liaising with clients, often speaks to them in Hindi or Urdu, which establishes a sense of familiarity and cultural sort of responsiveness in those relationships. The less fun part of the story is that they were saving up to actually put an offer. They currently rent the building and the property in the parking lot. And they were saving up the money to actually put an offer on the building, but because for an extended period of time during the pandemic, they were closed, they actually had to spend all of that money just paying rent because they just that's the only way they could keep the business afloat. They didn't want to give up on the space, and there is currently no sort of recognition of the cultural value of these spaces, so they don't qualify for any kind of support from municipalities or the province. And so they sort of almost after the pandemic had to start saving from scratch. And so that is a really sort of important part of the story, especially considering that I was doing this research during COVID. I'm not going to go into a lot more detail around the other case studies, but it is really important to kind of highlight that the learnings from this particular case study actually stood true for a lot of my other ones. And there are a lot of different sort of architectural typologies that these spaces occupy. So the first one was just a standalone industrial repurposed building surrounded by a parking lot. There are some that are part of strip mall plazas like this one, which is Swagat Banquet Hall in Mississauga, has a gym on one side and a kids' play space on the other. And there's a couple that are more standalone, newer, purpose-built, larger spaces, such as Scarborough Convention Center and Chandni, Victoria. These buildings vary in terms of their sizes, their built forms, their aesthetics, both inside and outside, their age, ownership, and history. But what they all share in common is that they are important places for various ethnocultural communities to practice their cultures, participate in various rituals and ceremonies, pass traditions on to future generations. And they not only host ethnic gatherings, they're also used for things like high school graduations and proms, for trade conferences, for student association gatherings, for birthday parties. And they also provide employment to a lot of workers, so they hire service staff directly, but also because of their existence, there's an entire ecosystem of cultural services such as DJs, photographers, caterers, DIY sector workers that actually are able to practice their businesses, many of whom are also ethnic entrepreneurs. So when we put this cultural value at the center of how we understand these spaces, it becomes really interesting to think about why they're currently left out of cultural and heritage planning frameworks. And this is where the focus for the intangible really comes in for me. The cultural value of these spaces is not considered currently within any of the policy frameworks. And this, in some ways, when you start digging in, is not surprising because a lot of the listed and designated heritage within each of these 3 cities that I studied primarily recognizes white settler colonial heritage. There is a gap between where spaces, especially ethnic communities, practice their culture. So for example, the blue dots on the map show places of worship or faith-based spaces. The black ones are the banquet halls, and the gray ones are designated heritage. So as you can see on the map, there is a gap between what municipalities recognize to be heritage and the places where communities are practicing their everyday cultures. And so when we think about what intangible heritage means in the context of our cities, it often is the quality or value that is associated with non-dominant, unconventional, or alternative forms of culture. It is the value that cannot accurately be described or articulated in a way that isn't super messy because it becomes about affective attachments to place. It's about the feelings, the memories, the kind of space-based attachments, the emotions, which are really hard to write down in the form of a heritage value assessment. Especially within Ontario, there are currently no ways to justify the preservation of a use of a space based purely on its intangible value. Sometimes it gets written into a report, but there's very few case studies where that intangible value actually gets preserved. And some of the other questions that I've kind of been grappling with is oftentimes heritage preservation or conservation is pitted as the end of a spectrum, and new development is at the end of that spectrum. And so when we kind of establish that in the sense of a dichotomy, what do we lose in that conversation? And if heritage is meant to be a reflection of societal values and memories at a certain point in time, why are our heritage designation processes so permanent? What role can the increased representation of ethnic communities and BIPOC folks who often have shorter histories of settlement in the GTA, what can their representation sort of bring to the table when we think about heritage designation? Why is heritage equated with historicity and age and the past? And if heritage often comes down to proving or providing demonstration of the uniqueness of a place, specifically a property or a building in the context of Ontario, then why are our parameters of identifying that uniqueness so obsolete and rigid? And if we can't do a good job of articulating through the traditional forms of written heritage value assessments the intangible heritage value of a place, then how do we move forward? And as I say this, I recognize that these, my words are not even close to coming, to capturing the sort of intangible value of these spaces. And so I did want to just end with sharing a few of the photos that are part of the crowdsourced exhibit that Alessandra mentioned. And this is my favorite part because I get to show photos which are much more evocative than any of the words that I can use. So this is one of my favorite photos from the exhibit. It's from the banquet hall that's attached to the All-Serbian Saint Serbian Orthodox Church in Mississauga. And this event was where the community gathered to celebrate a mortgage burning. So after 40 years, they'd paid off the mortgage on the church, and they got together and burnt the last loan document from the mortgage, just to kind of say, yes, we're here, this is our space. This is the bride and groom walking out in a procession after their Hindu wedding ceremony at a banquet hall, where the guests are sort of showering them with blessings and flower petals. And this is at Pearson Convention Center. A large part of the intangible value of being in these spaces is the sounds and the smells and the food and the textures, and so I would be remiss if I didn't include a picture of the food at these events. And this one, not so much an ethnic event, but it was a gathering, a fundraising event of a Peel region-based organization that is dedicated to inspiring, celebrating, and supporting South Asian girls and women called Ladliya. In my last slide, as part of the exhibit, I have folks leave sticky notes if they've experienced, hosted, been to an event at a gathering, or a gathering at a banquet hall, and this is just a few of them. One of them says, Auntie Sharice's wedding was fun. Yes, I have for my 8th grade graduation. It was a wonderful celebration and a beautiful send-off. My childhood was in these spaces. So much food, tons of room for dancing to a live band. So just to give you a sense of the fact that this is an important sort of space for a lot of communities, but not because of its tangible architectural value, but primarily because of the way in which it serves the needs for gathering for these ethnocultural communities. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sneha. That was fantastic. Please join me in welcoming to the stage Nicholas Jennings.
Thank you, Alessandro. And thank you, Mary Beth, for inviting me to take part in this symposium. I'm probably the least academic of the panelists, but I hope I can shed a little bit of light, at least from a music point of view, on the topic. I'm going to just pull out some notes here, and if I can balance the microphone while I refer to the notes. And I do have a few slides to show. I wanted to begin just by, well, I'll say it's been many years since I've been in this building. I actually, talking about intangible culture, I recall being in this building in the early 80s. I was singing with a folk group for a benefit concert that took place here, and we were opening for a fabulous group that was in Toronto at the time called Compañeros, and they were a group of exiled Chilean and Greek musicians. And so it's kind of strange to be on this stage again. I had a very short career as a musician. I've since transitioned into a music historian and journalist. But I just wanted to share that with you because this is a space that I have at least a little bit of history with. I think I also attended a few other concerts here. I want to begin by just quoting the American polymath, David Byrne, best known perhaps as the frontman of the band Talking Heads. David Byrne said, "The history of music is the history of the places where it's played." And I thought that was a very good starting point for what I'd like to talk about. And it sort of echoes a little bit what Alessandro quoted by Ian Gormley, that idea of what goes on inside buildings is every bit as important, if not more important, than the buildings themselves. So I just want to begin by saying that what I'm going to talk about is kind of a little bit of a personal story, but I hope it will reflect my interest in intangible heritage. I was a journalism student at Ryerson, what was then known as Ryerson. I'd grown up in Toronto. I knew about the music of downtown Toronto because I listening to top 40 radio and reading about the music in the local press. But I was too young to go downtown to Yorkville or to Yonge Street where all this music was taking place. Fast forward, I enrolled at Ryerson and I studied journalism. I needed a part-time job. And as luck would have it, I got a part-time job washing dishes and making cappuccinos in probably the last coffee house standing in Yorkville, which was known as the Riverboat. I was given the job. I'm just going to. This is the owner of the Riverboat, Bernie Fiedler, sitting in his club there, and I can just tell you, it was the greatest education I could possibly have, because when I wasn't washing dishes or making cappuccinos, I was hearing all this live music. Some of the greatest folk, blues, and jazz musicians in North America would come through this space. And it was a small space. It sat maybe 110 people. And it was below street level. It was a long, narrow room, as you can see, and it was decorated like a boat with portals and brass poles. I'm not sure if anyone in the audience ever went to the Riverboat. Mary Beth, yes, and a few others, yeah. So you'll remember, it was the beauty of it was the intimacy, that no seat was very far away from the stage. So you really got an up-close and personal encounter with the artists. And so I was exposed to a great deal of music, and a light bulb went off in my head and said, well, I can talk to these musicians, I can interview them. So I would go upstairs after the show to the dressing rooms, turn on my tape recorder, do interviews with these musicians, and write about them. And that was my introduction to music journalism through the Riverboat. I was deeply aware of the history of both the Riverboat and of Yorkville, and so I really felt the ghosts, if you like, that had come through there, because this was the mid-'70s, so it was sort of after the heyday of the Yorkville scene. So I was aware of, that people like Neil Young had played at a hootenanny, like an open mic night in the mid-'60s, and that. Let me see. Sorry, these are. And how. Bear with me. Yeah, here's. See, that's the kind of thing. Neil Young would have seen that advertised and would have signed up to play there at that early stage when he was trying to establish himself as a folk singer. Joni Mitchell, of course, was one of the many artists who got her start at the Riverboat. There she is on the stage of it. I was aware of all of that, and Gordon Lightfoot, who I wound up writing his biography, got his start in the Riverboat as well, and of course I met him there for the first time. Not that he would remember me years later when I approached him, or he approached me to do his biography. But so much history went on in that little space, and it led me to. By the time I graduated from Ryerson and I got my career going as a music journalist, I realized that story had not been told. The story of Yorkville, and all these clubs and coffee houses, and so I chose to pitch a book on the subject, and to my surprise, there had never been a book done on the Yorkville music scene. So I'm going to quote something here. Yorkville occupies less than a square mile of Toronto, bounded by Avenue Road to the west, Yonge Street to the east, Davenport to the north, and Bloor Street to the south. But for a roughly 20-year period, that little chunk of now prime Toronto real estate was one of the most fertile zones in North American music. Yorkville lingers now in imaginations because it was a tiny crucible of intensity and impact. What I realized was that Yorkville had this, there were coffee houses door after door after door. It was like a close concentration. I always likened it to being like a hothouse where the conditions just led to this blossoming of music. So I wound up writing this book called Before the Gold Rush, and it basically, my thesis really was that Yorkville became the birthplace of songwriting in Canada, and it was basically a sort of a runaway success. I'm trying to put my modesty aside here because it surprised me. I didn't know there was actually going to be that much interest in it at all, and I guess because no one had written about Yorkville, it took off, and it led to all kinds of opportunities for me. I worked on a documentary about Canadian music in the 60s, and all of this because of the intangible culture that I wrote about, which was the stories of the musicians and the clubs and coffee houses in Yorkville. And the book also touches on Yonge Street and the clubs on Yonge Street. But I want to just show you an illustration that I used in the book that has since become hugely popular among music fans, because it really, I commissioned a friend, an artist, to draw this map, and it basically lists all the clubs, coffee houses in Yorkville, and then similarly over on Yonge Street. And you know, it's funny because the inclusion of this map in the book led to all kinds of outreach, or the opposite of outreach. People getting in touch with me to say, you might be interested in this, or you know, I have stories related to that club or that coffee house owner, and so I kind of became this receptacle, I guess, if you like, of a lot more history than I'd even gone into in the book. So I'm going to get away from the book now and just tell you that what I did after that is I realized that I wanted to introduce more people to that history. So I introduced myself to Heritage Toronto, and I offered to do walking tours, which I started doing, and did quite a number, both in Yorkville and then later on Yonge Street, where I would take people along the streets, stop outside the former, the sites of the former clubs and coffee houses, and tell them stories about what went on in there. I would show photographs, posters, handbills, album covers, and then I got really sort of a little bit overly ambitious, and I started taking along a boom box with speakers and playing tracks by the artists, and anyway, it too was very, very successful. I'm not tooting my own horn here, except to say it proved to me that there's a great deal of interest in this history, this intangible culture, or intangible heritage. So I guess it's been a big part of my life and my career, telling these stories, documenting this history, trying to preserve this history, because I do believe that when the buildings go, and that happens with alarming frequency, you know, the risk is that the stories and the culture, the experiences that people had witnessing the music in these spaces is at risk of also disappearing. So I've along with the walking tours, I got involved with Heritage Toronto as a consultant on plaques. Now, I'm sure some of you are aware of the plaques that have gone up around Yorkville and Yonge Street, but I do have some slides if you'd like to see them. So for instance, there's the first one that went up in Yorkville of the Riverboat Coffee House. And you know, these plaques, they may be, you know, they may just give a little snapshot, a little brief history, but my hope is that the importance of these plaques, what they can do is they can trigger more investigation on the part of interested people who see them, stumble on them as they're going about their daily business. There are others like the penny farthing, another great coffee house that featured a lot of jazz as well as folk music. This is where Joni Mitchell actually got her start before the riverboat. The penny farthing, the Purple Onion. There was one done that's on Cumberland Street, devoted to the entire history, sort of an overview of the entire history of Yorkville's music scene. And then later, the same thing on Yonge Street with the clubs that took place there, because for those of you who don't know, the clubs on Yonge Street, the Yonge Street scene was probably the second, third, or maybe fourth at worst music scene in North America. It was during the 50s and 60s. It was sort of the place for an international artist to appear. There were clubs up and down Yonge Street, just like there were coffee houses all along Yorkville, featuring live music, often sort of with neon signs beckoning people in. But this was all, again, a history that I thought was hugely important, that hadn't been documented, and that these plaques were at least a way to help preserve a little bit of that history. There's ones at, let's see, the Town Tavern, which was probably one of the very first jazz clubs in Toronto, where Billie Holiday performed, among many others. And I think the Friars Tavern was initially a jazz club. Oscar Peterson had a residency there. Dizzy Gillespie played there. All the sort of leading jazz musicians came through, played the Friars Tavern in the late 50s and early 60s, before it transitioned, like a lot of clubs, to rock and roll. And the Friars Tavern is perhaps most famous as the place where Bob Dylan auditioned the group of Toronto musicians who became his backing group, the band. They were known as Levon and the Hawks at the time. So Friars Tavern leads me to the latest project that I've been involved in on this subject, which is the Friar, it was mentioned in the bio, the Friars Music Museum. It's the most unusual museum, and if you haven't checked it out, I encourage you to do so. It's on the second floor of the old Friars Tavern building at the corner of Yonge and Dundas Square. It's now a Shoppers Drug Mart, but happily, Shoppers gave us, those of us who started it, a significant corner of the second floor where we have a museum which is devoted to really celebrating the history of music on Yonge Street. The first exhibit did that. The second exhibit, the one that's currently running, is all about the Caribbean music scene in Toronto, and that will be up and running until early next year, and then there'll be another exhibit going in. All of this is by way of saying music heritage is linked to the spaces in which it is heard, and I'll be happy to elaborate on all of the deeper research that's gone on since my early work, which I'm really encouraged by. There's been so many more books, websites, social media pages now devoted to the clubs and concert halls in Toronto and their history. And I envision, hopefully in the future, there'll be a massive database that will collate all of this and really preserve the stories of these venues. So I'm going to leave it at that, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks so much, Nicholas. That was fantastic. Please give a very warm welcome to Michael McClelland, our final speaker. Yeah, you want me to? Or we could have this on the back. Yeah, okay. Yeah. Okay.
I actually prepared notes, and then I realized it's indecipherable. They're indecipherable. That's my handwriting. Anyway, my name is Michael McClelland. I wanted to thank everyone who actually has come today, because I think it's a really important discussion we're having. It's great that the ACO has organized this. It's great. The other speakers, I was just really moved by each presentation. I think this is a really interesting discussion about intangible heritage at this point in time. When Toronto is facing a lot of intensification, a lot of developments happening, there's more development in Toronto than any other city in North America. We're growing at an immensely fast pace. It's often uncomfortable to live in cities that are growing at fast paces. It's better to live in a city in decline. That's why Venice is so cool. It's been in decline for centuries. But we're not there. Did my sound just go? No? Okay. We're not there. When people talk about what kind of city we have to compare ourselves really to Asian cities like Shanghai. We shouldn't be comparing ourselves to London or Paris. We're not London or Paris. The development we have here is of an intensity that is unheard of in European cities. So we're really, and we have a huge amount of immigration. We can look at that as a really valuable thing in the sense that Toronto is the leading edge of understanding diversity and understanding difference, and that we actually have a culture that's based on this issue of diversity. And I was invited once to Sweden, and they said, well, as part of a competition, and I was the only Canadian, and they said, why are you here? And they said, well, you seem Swedish, but you're interested in diversity. And so they wanted to kind of learn. In the same way, a Chinese group came to Toronto for a tour, and we gave them a tour, and they were astounded that our libraries had many languages in newspapers and things like that, that we're open to this issue of diversity. So I think Canada, Toronto is on the leading edge of understanding that. However, we're in the backwaters about understanding intangible heritage. If just to do a bit of heavy-duty issue about how the Planning Act works in the City of Toronto, our planners are driven by the Planning Act. The Planning Act, if you look at it, doesn't talk about intangible heritage. If you look up, if you Google the word cultural, it mostly comes up with agricultural. Cultural heritage is mentioned a couple times very briefly in the Planning Act. But then it quickly says anything to do with heritage, cultural heritage, must be dealt with through the Ontario Heritage Act, which is another act. So at the City of Toronto, we've got a planning department and then a heritage department within it, which kind of duplicates what planning does. But the Heritage Act then goes on to sort of say, and it's been tightened up by the Doug Ford government, but the Heritage Act sort of says heritage is a property, it's a building. There's nothing about intangible heritage, it's all about a building. And the tightening up about what is a heritage resource, they've taken out the word significant, so there's no kind of nuance there. It's got to be a building. And so the Planning Act and the Heritage Act work together to sort of say, unless you're talking about a real building and that building is designated under the Heritage Act, it's not heritage. So you can't come forward and sort of say, well, I've got an interesting building, it's not designated yet. Doesn't matter, that doesn't count. So we have some very strict regulations which are tightening up and being worse and worse as we're going forward, and so we have to actually argue against that. That idea about designation is also interesting in contemporary international discussions about heritage. That's called authoritative heritage. It's the heritage of the ruling class, kind of. In other jurisdictions, we don't talk about class too much in Toronto, but it is definitely white settler heritage that's designated. Other heritage is not. And in international circles, we kind of now think that basically everything is heritage. That there's a potential that everything has heritage value. And just saw today, I'd never thought about the halls, banquet halls, as being significantly heritage, but they are, obviously. And so from everyone's perspective, anything can be heritage. It's a bit like the art world. Anything can be art. It really means assessing and understanding value and how you place value on certain things. And how is your value shared by others? And to what degree does your community speak up for its heritage, what's valuable? And so we have a real problem. And in other provinces, BC, Saskatchewan, Newfoundland have all been working with UNESCO to understand intangible heritage. Ontario has not been part of at the table about that kind of discussion. So we have something we really need to deal with pragmatically. And I think strategically it needs to be driven by community groups that have special interests. For different ethnic groups need to speak up and sort of say, our diversity is not being recognized because it's not. We do have a department of the city called Economic Development and Culture. And so I think that's, if we're looking at how to deal with the city in different ways, we need to look at economic development and culture and understand what their role is. They're proposing a culture plan this year. It's the first time in 20 years the City of Toronto has produced a culture plan. The last culture plan went nowhere. And so there's a real question about the effectiveness of economic development and culture, and how economic development and culture deals with planning and heritage at the planning level, and how they affect development. So I'm being a little bit detailed here, but I think it's really crucial to get the nuts and bolts of this down. I point to one really good example of how this might work in a certain way, which is a group called Blackhurst. That started as a bookstore, another book list. And as part of the Mirvish development, it was proposed that another book list was going to disappear pretty much. But the driver of that book list, the owner of that book list, was Ida, and Ida was a force to be reckoned with. And she basically said, well, I'm a cultural center. I have so much happening in my bookstore. I've got so many events and so many presentations and groups that meet here, and there's a whole history and narrative to how I'm connected to this community that you've got to listen. So we worked with Ida to pressure the city to bring economic development to the table. I phoned Economic Development Department frequently and sort of said, are you coming to the next meeting? To sort of say, let's do this. And they were able to come forward with a plan to sort of say, well, the bookstore maybe is a cultural hub. Municipalities can't support individual businesses, but they can support cultural hubs. And so we converted the bookstore into a cultural hub, and it now will have a 75-year lease to run programs similar to what they're already doing in this new space. And I think that's opening the door to a discussion about how economic development and culture could work in the development realm to conserve spaces. It's funny, when we think of heritage, we always think of protecting it, nailing it down, guarding it, and that sort of thing. With culture, you can actually think of it as nurturing it, allowing it to grow, thinking of it in a very positive light, as something that can develop and be bigger than it is. So there's a distinction there, but I keep thinking maybe we might benefit by moving slightly away from the word heritage and even intangible heritage to the word culture, and just thinking that through. I'm not sure whether that's, I think we lose something in that discussion, but it's simplistically to deal with the pragmatic aspects of what we've got to work with. Because I think the city has basically abrogated its responsibility to deal with heritage, intangible heritage, and culture. This building, by the way, is an example of where tangible heritage works very nicely, where conserving buildings of this type allow for all kinds of different uses. This started off as a Protestant church. Then it became a Jewish, I'm not sure whether it was exactly a synagogue, but it was a congregation. Synagogue? Yeah. And synagogue. And then it became a Chinese culture center. And then now it's owned by the city. So it allows, buildings of this character allow different uses to flush through it and kind of move through it. And I think it's a really interesting example. So I've said that the way we look at heritage right now is problematic. I think the Ontario Heritage Act, in its degree that it limits discussion about intangible heritage, and even tangible heritage from smaller community groups. So it took away the ability to list buildings, which was a kind of tentative, you could consider maybe it has some heritage value, which opened the door for all kinds of people to discuss stuff without it being overly wrought. That's been removed as well. So it's a kind of a binary yes/no scenario, which works it directly against the idea that heritage affects everything. Heritage is a broader, I think we've learned in the last 50 years that heritage is kind of an environmental issue. It's not so much about individual buildings, it's about the streetscape, it's about the neighborhood, it's about the community, and it has all of these, as we're talking today, intangible aspects to it. And it's absolutely essential for city building that heritage and culture be right at the forefront, that we need culture to be driving the bus, not at the tail end of it. And I was going to use as an example, other people talked about different interests. I was going to use as an example Church in Wellesley, which is the queer neighborhood, the gay community neighborhood, and just talk about that a little bit, because I've been talking to economic development about that, because there was a question, should it be a heritage district? I thought, oh God, not a heritage district. Kensington Market's a famous example. And a heritage district, you can protect the building, right? That's the Heritage Act. So you can protect the cheese shop in Kensington Market, but you can never ensure that the cheese shop itself will ever stay there. So it's going to be a protected thing with an awning, but who knows what's going to be in it. Because the idea about use is something that can't be governed by the Heritage Act. So it's very unfortunate. I think it's a bit of a dinosaur now when we talk about heritage. It's heritage as it was conceived 50, 60 years ago when the act was kind of put in place. So the gay and lesbian neighborhood, Church in Wellesley, I was saying, please do not. It's already suffering from gentrification, huge amounts of development. It's being wiped out. There's questions about, do you actually even need a gay neighborhood anymore? Like, gay people are everywhere. But the thought was that there are a number of reasons for retaining that neighborhood's character, one of which is that it has some significant things happening there. So it's got the oldest gay and lesbian bookstore in the entire world. It's got one of the largest gay and lesbian archives, I'd say in the entire world, but Canada for sure. It's got the 519 Community Centre, which is a very active, very interesting community centre. So, and then I've talked to other people and they say, well, Woody's, got to remember Woody's is a fantastic bar. So the Toronto Society of Architects has actually gone out and listed in a research project they're doing something like 170 gay and lesbian sites within that community that they think are important and interesting. Actually, there's a broader connection, but there's a lot centralized in that community. So talking to economic development, I was sort of saying, well, why don't we look at this as an economic development issue? Why don't we look at the fact that if Toronto thought wisely and strategically, this could be a tourist destination. Tourists come to Toronto all the time and they say, where's the gay and lesbian neighborhood? If you're in Berlin and you're using the transit system, it gives you a specific guide. You want to take the gay and lesbian tour. Like it's on the transit system. So there's a whole way that people can think about or even market this kind of issue. Also for many community groups, new immigrant groups that move here, they're not so good with their gay and lesbian families, and so the idea about gay and lesbian people being able to go somewhere in the city of Toronto outside of their community is crucial for them. So we need to rethink these things in terms of their character and their quality and their ability to contribute to diversity in the city of Toronto. And so we're currently meeting with Glad Day Books to see if it could be the next Blackhurst. It's got some of its own particular struggles, including struggles. I will go. But to think that there are other ways that we could actually start to think about these things, because at the current time, as Nicholas mentioned, we've got no way to protect musical venues. We're losing music venues. We're losing artist workspaces. We're losing all kinds of spaces that we're not even fully appreciating. That there's no appreciation of what the loss is, because we're not assessing it from that idea of diversity. So I think of some of the things I heard today, one of the very interesting things for me is our recent, fairly recent recognition of Indigenous culture and respect for Indigenous culture. And that wasn't a voice 20 years ago. That wasn't a heard thing. And I actually think from Indigenous culture, without appropriating Indigenous culture, there's a sense that we could learn certain things about how to understand the land and how to understand culture generally. So I think we could learn from Indigenous culture greatly, and that might be one of the blessings of Canada, to actually have that voice here. And then I think the only other thing I was going to say is that this discussion is very hopeful for me. It actually suggests that we could move beyond the current status of things, but we have to do it, I think, strategically, and I'd say politically. So we have to think politically, we have to think strategically about introducing these changes and making them happen. And there's a lot of fun to be had in responding to different communities' interests, because I think it's what makes Toronto fantastic, a fantastic city. Thank you very much.
I'm just going to say a few words, and you could sit down, then I'll invite everyone up. Yeah, whatever you want. Wow, those were all so different and related, and they were all, how's it now? Hello? They were different but related, and I just wanted to pick up briefly before we invite all our speakers and panelists to the stage to have an engaging and exciting conversation on the idea of the term intangible heritage, and just to think about the fact that words are really just tools. The only thing that gives them meaning is the way that we use them. And the goal of dictionaries, at least in principle, is to map the different ways that people use words. So it's not so much that we derive those meanings from the dictionary and adopt them. A dictionary is look to us to define what words mean, and those meanings change throughout time. So I have no doubt that this discussion that's about to ensue is going to sort of nuance and lend more specificity and animate the term intangible heritage. And I'm sure you'll be seeing some of what is talked about on stage here in the Oxford Dictionary in like 15, 20 years. So no pressure. I'm very excited to invite to the stage Lisa, Sneha, Nicholas, Michael's already on stage, and Michael and Stefan, the moderators. And you'll have to share microphones due to the mix-up. Thank you.
I think I flipped it. Based on the nods in the audience, I think I did. Well, first of all, thank you so much for joining us all today. And it's been a really incredible session, one in which, I think I've learned a great deal about intangible heritage. And all four of the speakers really resonated with me. But I think, to me, something special happened during Sneha's talk. Because I think as professionals, as whether we're architects or writers or heritage consultants or historians, we can look at this matter from a professional practice perspective. But when you showed a slide about the Serbian community event in Mississauga, all of a sudden I realized, wait a second, this is my community. This is something that I was actually part of. I know these events very well. But as a member of that community, I never perceived what we were doing to have real heritage value from the inside, not as a professional or a writer or as a journalist, but I thought this is just somewhere where we've been shunted out to here in Mississauga. And I think it could be a good way to sort of frame the beginning of the conversation is to actually look at it from the community perspective. And maybe, Sneha, is that something that happens within immigrant communities? Is that something that you've found that through the process of actually having these conversations, people perceive their own heritage and their culture in a different type of light? And I think, Lisa, in your talk as well, I think that from the sort of institutionalized practice of architecture and heritage and history, it's often very tempting to look at history, particularly Indigenous history, as I think something static and unchanging. But in the process of having those conversations and asking those open-ended questions, does it actually help to sometimes foster a different type of understanding of cultural heritage from within?
Did you want to start, Lisa? Yeah, it's a really interesting part, because when I talk about my research, a lot of time the responses I get is, oh, I never thought about it like that, but it makes so much sense. And so I do think communities don't think of their spaces as heritage, because heritage is not part of just a general conversation you have with folks. And that's partly why there isn't as much recognition of those places, because a lot of these communities are just trying to survive, they're just living their lives, they're not involved in heritage processes, they don't really understand what designation even means. Sometimes designation is seen as a problem because it keeps business owners from, or the building owners from, being able to make changes to their building, or it sort of adds more hurdles legislatively or in terms of regulatory hurdles. So it is a really interesting conversation because people see the value, but they don't necessarily use the word heritage, and that was a really important conversation that I had, because I also interviewed heritage and cultural planners as well, to your point, thinking about it in the context of cultural planning and heritage planning working together. And oftentimes what I learned was the engagement that was officially being done by municipalities often just said, they went to communities and said, what are your heritage sites? And they didn't recognize these spaces. None of these spaces showed up in those databases because communities don't use the word heritage normally unless they have to protect a particular thing in the face of displacement, for example. So that was my experience with my research.
I guess I would just say that for Indigenous peoples, the sort of list of activities and practices and ideas and worldviews that I outlined in the presentation, that's life and death. That's cultural life or cultural death. Loss of language means loss of more than anything external to these people. It is their identity. And so they'll use whatever language is on the table just in order to be able to get access to whatever's, whatever means to maintain that. If you want them to call it heritage, they'll call it heritage. But it's fundamentally a threat to their cultural identity. And so I guess that was part of the point, is this let's just say that the apparatus of heritage needs to do a lot more work to accommodate Indigenous peoples. And I would say that a lot of this work actually happens in the field of conservation, because it's very much land-based. And so, on the quote-unquote natural side of conservation, the discussion about Indigenous heritage is quite well developed. But of course, we have very urban indigenous communities. I mean, and so these places now are becoming places of where these identities are playing out. And so, yeah, we're just ill-prepared, quite frankly. Yep.
I just have a follow-up question for Lisa. I thought it was really interesting, you talking about language and people using whatever language is on the table, and it's such a big part of this intangible heritage discussion that we're having. Like I'm thinking a lot about, as I'm seeing these presentations, I'm thinking a lot about the parallels that seem to exist between sort of what we now refer to as kind of like vernacular architecture and sort of traditional architecture, one being one that follows the academic tradition and one that being sort of the representation of what people sort of naturally do and often do in order to survive in their different contexts. And I was wondering if there is language that you're starting to see emerge that is useful and effective and is more appropriate and in keeping with sort of indigenous way of seeing things.
I guess I would say that, well, I mean, two things sort of come to mind, and that is, one, within indigenous communities, of course, if there is to be, no, not pun intended, a keystone to heritage, it's language. It's language and land. It's those two things, and those two things are inextricably connected. And not only connected, they absolutely rely on each other. And so if you start to lose language, you start to lose a relationship to land. If you lose your relationship to land, you lose language. And so those two things are very inextricably connected. So language is absolutely critical and is not part of our lexicon from a conventional heritage framework, right? We don't, language is over there in the culture department. I'm not sure where it lives, but it's certainly not in the heritage department. And so we're not very equipped to deal with that, I don't think. The other side of heritage, or the other point, I guess, would be the communication of heritage is often through storytelling. And so I think that needs to be paid more attention to. I think we need to pay more attention, not only storytelling beyond community, which is, fair enough, but storytelling within community, and how does that happen, and how do you support that, and not, again, ask it to be something else, just in order to gain access to funding or whatever, yeah.
I think this question of storytelling and language is so central. I think even language is sort of a through line and an organizing principle. The way Alessandro, I think, quite intelligently framed the whole session is in terms of how we define words, what we understand language to be. And then that idea of storytelling, I think storytelling is always a process. It's always something that's live. And it makes me think, of course we have this paradigm, we need to understand heritage as a living thing, as an evolving thing. But I think our most sort of typical institutional, historical, sort of Anglo-centric perspective of heritage is, well, it's a building, and it matters because that building is old. So I wonder even, and to bring Nicholas and Michael into the conversation, when we do look at sort of elements of cultural history that have now changed. So we're looking at, for example, folk music and rock and roll music, and obviously the venues no longer exist, but we've found really powerful ways to commemorate them. And when we look at something like Church Wellesley Village, for example, the sort of role that it plays within the sort of texture of the socio-cultural fabric of the city is always changing. But when we look at the idea of preservation now, and I think, Michael, it's something that you hinted at in your talk, there is a risk of just a sort of museum approach to heritage. You know, how do we take a neighborhood like this and not just sort of crystallize it in amber, but allow room for evolution, allow room for new meanings, and allow for something more than just a sort of historical tour? And I think at the same time, you know, as we've found ways to preserve and commemorate former music venues, Nicholas, you've talked about current venues being in crisis. And so I wonder, you know, what are some approaches and what are some things that are happening where we can sort of better preserve that idea of heritage and as a living and evolving thing in these communities?
Well, I would just say that, yeah, I mean, there is a crisis, or there has been a crisis, I should say, back up. In the disappearance of live music venues in Toronto. That's been well reported. I think all of you would have heard about that and seen evidence of it. I've forgotten the number now, but I think it was over 50 music venues had shut down leading into the pandemic, and then of course it escalated during the pandemic and post-pandemic. But you know, the thing about live music is that it's not going to go away, I don't believe. I think anyone who loves music knows that its value is seeing it performed live. There's nothing that can replace that. And so what we're seeing now in Toronto is there's actually a new wave of resurgence of new live music venues. And so that's encouraging on that front. But, you know, it's like the Joni Mitchell song, you don't know what you've got till it's gone. I mean, those live music venues that have gone, there's rich memories that people who in Toronto have tied to those venues. So my interest is in getting those stories about those experiences people have had, what they remember about these venues, and have them chronicled in some way. And it doesn't need to just be in a music exhibit, a static form. I mean, what I love about, take just one example of a Toronto music artist who has undergone a massive discovery is the transgendered artist Jackie Shane. She was a rhythm and blues artist in Toronto in the 60s who, I mean, you talk to anyone, and I was too young to go to these clubs to see her perform, but I've heard the recordings and I've seen some scant video footage that exists. Astonishing talent. And anyone who saw her perform on Yonge Street in those days is still, you know, they get goosebumps talking about what it was like to see her perform. So the good news is that Jackie Shane has undergone this discovery where there was a radio documentary on CBC that led to a feature film documentary which has just come out. I think it's available now. You can see it, called Any Other Way, which is the title of Jackie Shane's biggest hit. And there's a biography being done. There's also a heritage plaque to Jackie Shane at the site of the club, the Sapphire Tavern, where she was a resident artist. So there's layers upon layers of commemoration taking place around just this one artist and the venues that she performed in. And so that's really encouraging. And that has, like I say, that has nothing to do with a music exhibit, but it's just another way that history is getting preserved and retold.
Okay, I'll take another take on it. I think another way to think about intangible heritage is to think about it as living heritage. There was, about 30 years ago, something called the NARA Convention. And at the NARA Convention, the country of Japan and the Northwest Indigenous folks both spoke about what authenticity means to them. And the NARA Convention is about authenticity. And they said, well, for the Indigenous people, they said, well, keeping a totem pole in a museum is not heritage. What's heritage is making sure is letting the totem pole rot in the forest, its natural life, and it was the ability for people to actually be able to reconstruct a totem pole, for younger people to actually know the trade of how to do that, know the skill of how to do that. So that's a kind of living heritage. They understood authenticity as being living heritage. Same as the Japanese people were sort of saying, well, we're not like Italians, or we're not like the French, or we're kind of ruling the heritage world at that point, to sort of say, well, we actually deconstruct and reconstruct our buildings. They're still heritage for us. And so this living heritage issue is frankly what we're seeing in this audience right now. The fact that Nicholas is interested in Jackie Shane is the living heritage. It's a kind of respect for communities. And if there is no community, and there was a huge discussion about Angkor Wat a number of years ago about how the indigenous community, the local community, the community right around Angkor Wat, were not engaged with the tourist site of Angkor Wat. And it was at a certain point, what does Angkor Wat mean to the people who live there? And there needed to be a connection between community and these things that were regarded as having heritage value. And so the living heritage piece is, I think, really important to kind of understand that we need to be respecting and acknowledging our history. Heritage has a bad turn to it too. Heritage as it's our culture, not your culture. It's our, in French, it's patrimoine, which is very paternalistic. And so there's a kind of sense of guarding a culture, and that's the kind of opposite of the direction we want to go. We want to be looking at something that's shared, that's something people can learn from. We still step on each other's toes about appropriation in different cultures. But we need to figure out how to respond and learn and grow with these things. But I think that's the clue, living heritage. So it's actually something that communities are actively engaged in, and that's why it's worth keeping these things. Yeah.
I like that idea, Michael. Living heritage. It's a good tweak on the intangible. Yeah.
I think it's also something that obviously is really deeply reflected in forms of heritage that are in activity. As Lisa says, it's life or death. It's not just a matter of something abstract being represented or commemorated. Or I think in the instance of the banquet halls, it's the building itself is just a vessel, right? It's like ensuring that what happens inside it is allowed to flourish and grow. And I think the way, Sneha, you've presented it, it's really a quintessentially Torontonian type of thing. I can't think of too many cities in the world that sort of have that type of urban condition. So I think, yeah, that's really something quite unique that sort of ties these together. And I think on that, the idea of the suburban banquet halls, is there now a sort of evolution of how these types of spaces are being approached from an institutional standpoint, from heritage planners, from architects? I know in your work as an academic, have you witnessed any type of movement there?
Yeah, so I, as part of my research, interviewed heritage and cultural planners, and part of that process was them also asking me questions, because I had spoken to the banquet hall owners before I approached them. And so there are some cases where, for example, and I use cultural and heritage planners because, like Michael mentioned, there are cultural planning efforts that actually happen at a municipal level, and in some ways, those are more local, and there are more powers for those sort of departments to respond to the local cultural conditions of their municipalities. So for example, in Brampton, there's a cultural services department, and the heritage planning sits with city planning. In Toronto, heritage planning is with city planning, and cultural spaces and development is within economic development and culture. And in Mississauga, which was the more unique case, heritage planning and Indigenous relations and cultural planning actually work together in terms of a team. And I think that's an important sort of thing to look at as well, where the cultural planners and heritage planners, are they working together? And I think for that, a lot of my conversations with cultural planners were actually a little bit more generative in terms of incorporating banquet halls. So for example, the city of Brampton, when I spoke to them, they were redoing their cultural maps, and cultural mapping is used as a tool to kind of document the spaces that are considered important by municipalities, culturally important by municipalities. And so Brampton said that in their work, they would include banquet halls within their cultural maps. That was one example. And then I also, as part of my research, was invited to present at the Mississauga Heritage Advisory Committee because they saw the value. They've been trying to diversify their heritage registers and really been grappling with how do we expand upon how we see heritage within our municipality to represent, because their population is very, very diverse, I think even more so than Toronto. And so thinking about how can we sort of consider heritage designation for spaces that are important to ethnic communities. So those are just a couple of efforts that I know of, but I also finished this research a year ago, so I'm not completely up to date.
Can I just ask Sneha a question? I was interested how, was it Osai?
Mm-hmm.
How you said she was able to tell you a lot of the history of other cultural groups that use that her particular banquet hall. I mean, I think that's fantastic, and that it makes me wonder about history collecting and archives and so on. Like, I mean, this building, for instance, I mean, is it community run? Can someone tell me? Is it? It's city run. So would the city have, Michael, an archive of the history of this building? What's taken place in this building over the years? No. So it would require an activist or a concerned citizen to gather that information and you know, basically make it accessible. Yeah, see, I think that's what people like in this room and people on the stage here are, you know, it's important for that work to be done, you know, on different levels. And someone in the audience was asking me about what else is being done in terms of music venue research. And I can tell you it's just sort of escalating like crazy now. There are people who are going deep into the archives, into the microfilms in the Toronto Reference Library, and finding out, you know, who played where, when, and it's painstaking work that takes a lot of time and effort. But now the fruits of their work is coming to the fore. They're publishing, or they're putting up websites with this kind of archival information, and it can happen through. It doesn't need to be just music. It can be archival research for all of this cultural activity.
Yeah. Can I mention, if you go to Chicago, the cab drivers know all about the architecture of Chicago, because Chicago is known for its fantastic architecture. So that even the cab drivers can tell you, that's the Burnham and Root building. And there's a level by which you can get a very sophisticated culture developed. And cities that have a good cultural flair have this mix of just people knowing stuff, that they actually know about the things that are interesting in their community. And you have to build that. It's a building up. It's like city building is like building birds building a nest. There's all kinds of different pieces have to be brought together, and you're kind of trying to make something that's a home for everybody. And it really is based on these very small twigs that get brought into the picture.
I'm just going to ask, well, Nicholas, with your work, I think one of the things that's really interesting about music venues is they feel a bit like a microcosm for almost like culture, heritage, but how it's played out in the modern era, and the fact that you can capture the qualities of the space, put it on record, means that venues don't just exist in the building, but people have the opportunity to take them home, put a record on, and kind of recreate that venue. And I just, I can see so many examples of how that has sort of how that exists now, and with new forms of communication, with like YouTube and things like that, and TV and whatnot. But I wonder if there's other sort of earlier examples that music venues kind of point towards in the past, and that's maybe part of the story of why we're so compelled by these venues as kind of like modern examples of what existed before modernity, before the industrial era, and so what and so forth.
Well, I mean, what comes to mind, Michael, is Toronto in the 50s and into the 60s was a much more liberal urban center for artists of color. And not that there wasn't racism in Toronto, there certainly was. But what I and others have found in my research, and others have found in their research, is that because of this acceptance and welcoming of artists of color, Toronto became like in a funny sort of way, like a modern day stop on the Underground Railroad, in the sense that artists found a home here. And so you had this migration of American primarily jazz and rhythm and blues artists who moved up to Toronto. First of all, they came up here to play. They played Toronto, they played Montreal. And then a number of them started to actually stay and plant roots here. I mean, Jackie Shane being one of those artists. But George Clinton and Funkadelic also moved up here and had a base here. And so many Caribbean artists came up from Jamaica as well. So it's like there was a community here that welcomed those people. And those clubs on Yonge Street and in other neighborhoods in Toronto, were safe spaces for them. So I found that really interesting, that was a sort of a migratory side story to the way music has evolved in Toronto.
I think so much of that is about, as you say, being able to collect those stories. It strikes me, to Michael's anecdote about the Chicago cab drivers having this sort of rich inner encyclopedia of architecture, and there is a sort of public culture, that idea. I think it's a beautiful metaphor of sort of building that nest to create the complexity of that public culture, of conversations, storytelling. But I worry that we're pretty bad at building that nest sometimes, especially within the professions sort of urban planning and architecture. We're bad at having those conversations. Lisa, in the beginning of your talk, I think you had a really important point about consultation fatigue, that sometimes, it's really burden on communities that doesn't end up being something generative, or doesn't end up being something substantial, or even maybe it interferes with people's lives. In the city of Toronto, I know we've talked about, if we're going to do public consultations, maybe we ought to provide food and childcare and things like that, so that we can actually create a space for communities to have those conversations. At the same time, I think sometimes in urban development circles, it's almost seen as in a negative light, whether it's, people talk about community consultation with regards to empowerment for NIMBYism and stuff like that. But obviously being able to have these conversations, to collect these stories, whether it's about the musical history or about how our city evolves, is really, really paramount. So I think, and it's a question to everybody here, what is some advice that you have for professionals, whether in heritage planning or cultural planning or architecture and urbanism? How do we actually foster and promote a healthy conversation and create a good dialogue in which people feel comfortable and in which it's not, a sort of extractive relationship?
I'll go at that. I feel, unfortunately, that we have a very diverse community, and I think in having diverse community, we really need also strong leadership. And I find that the official plan of the City of Toronto is way out of date. All kinds of things like the yellow belt comes from the official plan. So there's all kinds of things that are there that are problematic. All the development in the downtown core comes out of the official plan, which is, all, again, extremely problematic. And I think that I'll be very, I think the planning department's lost its direction and doesn't have a clear vision for the City of Toronto. I'm hoping that our new mayor will step in, fingers crossed, right? Because I think leadership is absolutely essential in making things happen in a political way. Stefan, you mentioned a kind of the problem with you can do over consultation where just you've consulted to death and no one actually turns up at the meetings anymore and that sort of thing. That's a serious problem. But I think we need strong leadership within the different communities to speak up on their behalf, to sort of say these things are important. I think we need to reframe the conversation entirely to really make things work better. It's something that everyone can work at. So inside City Hall, inside the planning department, people can be working at helping to figure out this restructuring where culture comes to the fore, where culture is actually what we're talking about. The diversity of our culture is a thing that drives the City of Toronto. It's not the back of the bus. So.
I guess I would just say that, you know how you hear the expression tone deaf. I just think that a lot of the asks are completely irrelevant, or can be in a lot of cases. And so there's just no basis for proper discussion at that point. I think I think somehow you have to entertain the idea of, or you have to prioritize the relationship that enables a certain quality and caliber of conversation that we just don't partake in around the notion of heritage. And part of it, I would say leadership, absolutely, but I would also say, what are we trying to do? I mean, there's you know, just on what we've heard today, there's lots of different things. We can commemorate, we can tell story, so share. Are we trying to preserve physical spaces? I mean, what if we still had those coffee houses around? What would Yorkville look like today, kind of thing? You know, so some of it absolutely has to do with the preservation of physical spaces. But what's the very specifically an Indigenous perspective, if you're going to community and you're asking something, and what ultimately is in it for them? How's that helping them sustain their culture? How is that helping them, on the question of intangibility, that's across the board to all communities. What is this? So I think we've realized that the conventional built heritage framework doesn't fit for maybe where we're at right now. But what does? So we just need to do better, quite frankly, and really ask ourselves, how do we do better, and what's required in order to do that, and not leave it on the shoulders of communities to figure this out, because we should be doing some of that heavy lifting. Yeah.
Can I just add, I think Lisa brought up some really good points. I do think that, if you're going to have the planning board put some onus on the developer to investigate what was the culture of this building? What was the culture, the history of this building? And then put the onus on the developer to ensure that heritage is reflected somehow in the building. I mean, I can give you an example. I was involved in the Silver Dollar just over here, and you know, some of you may know the Silver Dollar was a great music venue for many years. Its sign was going to be destroyed and by the developer. The city stepped in because a number of us raised the alarm, and the city had the sign designated. And I think one of the conditions, correct me if I'm wrong, if someone knows the actual details, but I think the city also imposed on the developer the requirement that space that the Silver Dollar was in continue to act as a live music venue. So this speaks to what you were saying, Michael, about you know, Kensington Market Heritage District, you know, but the cheese shop, the building may be preserved, but the cheese shop may get lost.
Yeah, I was involved in the Silver Dollar too.
Okay. So I mean, I'll just jump in and say, I do know that they preserved the look of the Silver Dollar space. It's very antiseptic, doesn't really look like the Silver Dollar I remember, but at least they preserved the appearance of a music venue. But do you know what I found out, Michael?
What?
The developer did not put in any kind of proper plumbing, or there's no kitchen. So, I mean, it can't function as a bar.
Yeah, so that's exactly one of the dumbest examples ever, because it was an attempt to save the Silver Dollar, and I was at what they call the Ontario Land Tribunal, arguing the Silver Dollar should be conserved, and at least the music venue should be conserved. And my sense of the interpretation was that maybe you keep the facade, but then you'd provide a music venue, provide a space that could be a music venue. What they did instead, dumb, was they reconstructed the really badly laid out Silver Dollar room.
A facsimile.
A facsimile without any idea about how it might be used, without any offer to, and so no one's actually picked it up. It's sitting there, like no one's
empty.
And so that's the dumbest misinterpretation of providing a music venue. Anyway.
I think for me, one of the things that came up when I was doing my research was that a lot of the folks that are in leadership positions in cultural and heritage planning are white. And I think we do need to kind of diversify representation of the communities that are residents of our sort of the cities that we live in terms of who has the power and who's doing the research and who's talking about sort of doing those assessments. And I think there's a concept from public health, specifically working with Indigenous communities, that I've found really helpful, which is around cultural safety. So oftentimes as designers, as planners, we talk about cultural responsiveness, which puts the power into our hands and said it's our responsibility to respond to the cultural needs of the communities that we serve. And cultural safety is a concept that actually puts the power in the hands of the user. So for example, if there's a service being provided, it's about asking the user, do you feel culturally safe being here? And I think in a lot of consultations, I would argue that people don't feel culturally safe being there and expressing their cultures and being part of those conversations. So I think that's an important piece. And I think at a more meta level, I think even thinking about how we have a Department of Heritage Planning and Heritage Architecture and Cultural Planning, I think that itself is a problem because culture and heritage exists in everything. It's in how we live and how housing is built and how we use streets and pretty much everything. So to me, it's even problematic that we separate it out into a department or a master plan or a specific act. But I know that's a very meta level sort of thing to say.
You know, I think it's a really important point, though, about the diversity of the city and the feeling of cultural safety. I think is something that doesn't exist in a lot of these types of environments, but moreover isn't really even a paradigm that gets considered. But it also strikes me, you know, in the conversation about the Silver Dollar room, maybe it ties together a lot of the themes we've been talking about here. Sometimes, you know, saving a facsimile of the built environment, if you look at it from a sort of very literal standpoint, isn't that great heritage preservation? They rebuilt the building, they rebuilt the venue exactly as it used to be. That's got to be some really like sensitive heritage work. And it's interesting, I think it sort of touches on everything we've talked about, that the most spatially literal form of preservation can be the least culturally sensitive. Well, I think we're going to have an opportunity for some questions from the audience, I think, if, yeah. We've got one.
Heritage planning was part of economic development and culture. Then when the city's development industry started to explode, a past councillor who was associated with the gay village moved it into planning. And that was contentious. But the thinking was that as part of planning, they would be consulted over the value of the heritage building. Well, you've got two problems. One, you've got the OLT, the Ontario Land Tribunal, even if something is considered valuable by the city, by these very rigid rules that just hang on to bricks. That doesn't matter. But the other thing is this whole sense of intangible culture. I mean, I think it's really fun that something called the Architectural Conservancy is the one that's talking about intangible culture. So that's what you lose. And one of my biggest pulling out my hair, because I live in the annex, is when you have a building where they say the facade, but it's the expectation of what you're going to see when you go through that facade, and they have no relationship to each other. Or when I was on preservation board, my all-time favorite thing to hate was what they're doing with the Fillmore, because we had a presentation where the heritage architect talked about how they were saving the windows, they were saving this and saving that, but one of the architects on our committee said, "You're saving the windows, but you're going to look onto bicycle storage?" And the answer was yes. So I double-checked that, and that was correct. I said, well, why are you doing that? And it's because they had to build an athletic facility, a fitness room in the new building. I said, this is Fillmore's. You've had more athletic activity there in the past few decades. Why not keep that athletic activity where it was? And it was like, but you know, so with the city, it's like, it's this thing that they don't know what to do with. Well, it hasn't worked well in culture because it was too cultural. It hasn't worked well in planning because it decontextualizes the building. So what do you do in a city as big as Toronto?
Other questions?
First of all, I'd like to thank the Architectural Conservancy for organizing this, because I've been working with Intangible Heritage, excuse my voice, for about 50 years. And once in a while I look up Intangible Heritage in Ontario, and guess what? I found this. So yay, welcome to the club. I work with something here in Toronto called the Community Folk Art Council, so I very much recognized your stories about Cecil Street, because I've danced many times here, because as a dancer, that's certainly an intangible heritage as well. But if you want to know what to do with intangible heritage, in Canada, you go to Whitehorse and you see the Kwandong Dung Cultural House, I think that's what it's called, which I have had the privilege of seeing. And what you've done there with the garden, with the grandfather's room, is just stunning. So that I would recommend anyone to go to see that place in Whitehorse. But my question is, why have you not mentioned the UNESCO Convention on Intangible Heritage of 2003? You realize that you're not alone in the world talking about intangible heritage. Certainly, Canada is one of 3 countries in the world that have not signed this convention. And I'm beginning to see, because I'm also president of something called Folklore Canada, I know what other provinces are doing on intangible heritage, and Ontario is sort of unfortunately bottom on the list. So again, I'm thrilled that you have given attention to this. But why this vacuum? Why this black hole in Ontario?
Should I comment on that? It's very interesting, and when we say there's a National Historic Site in Canada, it doesn't mean anything, because the federal government has no control. Goes back to the founding of Canada. The federal government has no control over real property, and so the National Sites of Canada just identify things as of value, but hopefully not controversial. And each province is left up to its own considerations, and that's probably why we haven't signed on with UNESCO. And I did mention other provinces are working actively with them, and they have different statements that they've made about how to understand Indigenous heritage in Canada. But then when you read the fine print, it's not all of Canada. So there's work that needs to go on there. I'm a board member of ECOMOS Canada, which is the subset of UNESCO, and we're actively encouraging members to join and get on the boat about this. But we have a province which is frankly resistant and antagonistic to heritage interests. And in fact, it's the kind of government that the more we tackle and say things are important, the more they're going to try and destroy them. So we just have to keep working at that and wish for the best. But again, the international community is very interested in these issues, and we have really advanced sense around the world about intangible heritage. So, you know, Brazil has the tango as an example of identified international intangible heritage.
Michael, I would just add to that you know, I was talking with Michael, who studied in Liverpool, and I just visited Liverpool this summer. And I was telling Michael how impressed I was with how much music heritage preservation there is in Liverpool, not just around the Beatles. But of course, that's a major part of it. And by the way, they have the Cavern, the club that the Beatles started out in, recreated. But at least it's a functioning music venue. There's live music in it every night.
Better.
But yeah, so that's an improvement. But I was going to say that Liverpool got itself designated as a UNESCO music city. Toronto, for all of this deep, deep, rich music history it has not taken that step. You know, I think even under our best forgotten mayor, Rob Ford, there was this push for Toronto to be made a music city, and, you know, partnering with Austin, Texas, and, you know, there was this kind of, I think it coincided with the creation of the Toronto Music Advisory Committee at City Hall. But sadly, they've dropped the ball on that. They have not pushed forward with this vision of making Toronto a music city, nor have they taken the, I think, the no-brainer kind of step to apply to UNESCO to have Toronto, make a case for it, and have Toronto designated as a music city. Because if it did have that, there would be a lot more. See, I think the reason the province, Michael, isn't interested in heritage is because they don't see the dollar value in it. I mean, there are so many things that Toronto could capitalize on from a tourist point of view.
Yeah.
And music heritage is just one of many. And yet, you know, unless they can see where's the dollars coming in, you know, they're not interested. So the case has to be made, I think.
I think we might have had another one in the back there.
Yes, regarding the David Burton quote on music, what was it again about music being tied to place or?
Yeah, it's basically, I'll just read it again because it's, I think
Okay.
it's worth remembering. The history of music is the history of the places where it's played.
Yes, but you know something I was thinking of that it's not just, let's say it's like played like in a venue, but almost like played in the sense of sort of where we encounter it. It is something encountered, and what I was thinking was that is that there's something special about like even Toronto's relationship to that, as far as tangibility and all that, in the sense of I'm thinking of Toronto's own R. Murray Schafer as being, let's say, the one who popularized the concept of soundscape, which is really about our relationship to the music and the oral experiences around us. And I think that's an interesting thing to sort of relate to all that, and it even goes with music. I mean, it's not just when we encounter in the clubs, but also, let's say, when we think of heritage in the past, when we listened it to on the radio, like on 1050 Chum, like with you and myself and whatever else like that, or just when we just go around the city and hear it as a kind of viral, kind of shared presence. Now, I think there's something to be said about that. And in a broader sense, I sometimes think these days about how these days when earbuds and headphones have kind of privatized a lot of the experience, and in some ways, that's a kind of intangibility which is often endangered and disappearing. Although we still do come across it in things like street festivals, like DJ turntable things, or when you go in the park and families or wherever ethnicity having their picnics and the music and all that. So, but I think that's something to reflect upon and relate to Toronto, the notion of soundscape, and how that, in ways like with that, just like with let's say somehow anyone from Marshall McLuhan to Jane Jacobs or whatever, I think R. Murray Schafer should be incorporated in that kind of strangely weird, poetic, holistic Toronto way of visualizing our sense of place. So I just wanted to make note of that, and if any of you have anything to say about that, go ahead.
For whatever reason, that's just triggered one thing that I just wanted to say, which is getting back to the banquet halls, which I do think that the music, there's music as well in the banquet halls. I mean, I was writing for a weekly Toronto newspaper called iWeekly, and I was writing a column about all the other culture music outside of rock and roll, and I was going to banquet halls in North York and Mississauga and Brampton and hearing incredible like Bhangra performances, high life performances, Sukus performances from Central Africa. I mean, it was astonishing. And the same could be said about community centers and other spaces across Toronto where there have been cultural activities. I mean, it is the spaces ultimately that breed that culture and that history.
Any other questions?
And can I just ask Lisa, I mean, here in Toronto, I mean, there is the Native Cultural Center on Spadina. It's called Canadians, yeah. And I think that has had a history of cultural performances, activity. I'm sure they have an archive.
It has an archive, but what's interesting about it is that the only thing that people have in common is they're Indigenous and they're living in Toronto, but they come from all across the country. So there's multiple languages, helping for job searching, all sorts of things, and then the law and retirement homes right next door to it. So now in the attic we have an Indigenous park that call myself part of an Indigenous thing now, put together by people from the farming. And
Jeff, did you? Oh, sorry to interrupt you. Yeah.
Thank you. Great symposium. We're missing, of course, as mentioned at the beginning, we're missing the speaker from Black urbanism. But I'm wondering, as a viewer of the city scene, the city planning, there was a project to work with the Black community in the sort of West Eglinton, Dufferin area because of the mayhem caused by the Eglinton LRT going through, the tunneling and destruction of a number of businesses. So I'm wondering if anybody on the panel can give us a quick update on that, because that's a good example of not, I don't think it was a heritage conservation district study, because the focus was not on architecture, it was on social, economic, and culture. Just wondering where that stands, if anybody knows. There was a study, sort of a multidisciplinary city project, not run by heritage planning, but more by economic development. But where's that stand? And has it come up with some plans that could really give us a bit of an example, a model of working with this kind of field that we've been talking about today in intangible or cultural heritage?
Well, I can't go into a lot of detail, but I know Dane today was going to be talking about the Little Jamaica Community Land Trust. So Chi Yi, who was also going to be here today, she was going to be talking about the Toronto Chinatown Land Trust as well. So really seems as if, not just in Toronto, but across Canada, the land trust model is picking up momentum as a way of preserving not just buildings, but also kind of like business endeavors and, as a result, culture.
In Little Jamaica as well, it's, I believe, becoming the first designated cultural district in North America. And it's a project led by a great local placemaker, Jay Pitter. In the very minimal capacity that I was involved with the project, I think the methodology was really interesting because we did a series of walks through the neighborhood, talking to folks in the various businesses, from the hair salons to the patty shops to the, clothing shops that make the neighborhood what it is. And, I think I can't speak too much of it because my role in the project was very limited, but it did start from, I think, a rather unique point of genesis, is that you go and engage with these communities, and exactly as Lisa was saying, you ask open-ended questions. And then the paradigm of value that emerges isn't just the facade or the patty shop or the hair salon, but the whole intricate network of community connections that exist within, the sort of community safety and placemaking and culture that exists in this environment where people are spending their time together, people get to know one another. And so I think, at the risk of saying too much, I think the genesis of it came from a very different type of place than how we would usually create a heritage conservation district and say, here's a contributing property, here's a non-contributing property. This building is important because of its architectural quality, this building isn't. So I think it is very difficult to sort of coalesce that into a formal policy framework, but already I think it's shaping up into something quite different than anything we've ever seen before in North America.
I could comment briefly about that as well, because it did start off, the community was going, we want our neighborhood to be identified as something special. So the only mechanism they could think of was a heritage conservation district. So they were pushing for a heritage conservation district. And the city stepped in, said, we'll make it a heritage conservation district. Then there was discussion about what would the actual impact of that be. We were pushing economic development to sort of think about districts separately. So the gay and lesbian neighborhood, Chinatown, and Little Jamaica were the three areas that they were looking at. And so they, with the help of Jay Pitter, who's an amazing character because she's never done this kind of stuff before, and she stepped in and quite bravely kind of led the charge. And I think the result has been, with the support of economic development, to create this new kind of cultural district. And I think these are little signs of things actually turning around a little bit in a very interesting way. We have to find out, we have to see, the test has to be, how does that work? How does that really work? And I'm not, I've read the documents, I'm not clear, but God bless Jay that she's pulled this off.
Yeah, also, I also don't have a lot of knowledge, but my question to them has always been like, what are the teeth? Like, yes, we designated a cultural district, but does that actually have teeth in terms of policy or change? And I know I studied planning in the US, and so I know that in the US there are arts and cultural districts which almost operate as zoning overlays. So that's where kind of cultural heritage zoning work together, and it's not separate, and where zoning through an overlay district can actually impact how those buildings functions. And there are special conditions built in for those sort of the local nuance of the culture for those areas. So I'm curious if that's the direction that the city will go in terms of cultural district, but from what I understand, they don't quite have that figured out yet. Yeah, I mean, I don't have an answer, but it is kind of, it goes back to the idea of living, I think, living culture and living heritage, where if we identify something as permanent and then we designate it for perpetuity, that like is problematic because people change, people move, cultures, like those things kind of in many ways are cyclical in cities, so.
Hello. So I have a question. I think I'll maybe direct it at Michael and Sneha, but I would love to get everyone's perspectives. The question is really about sort of where we direct advocacy as far as this conversation of intangible heritage. You know, I think it's great that the ACO is doing the symposium, but, you know, also noting that the ACO historically has sort of reactively done legislative advocacy to maintain the status quo of heritage as it's currently written. So this is a sort of new development. And for context, I work at the University of Toronto as a researcher trying to make links between how place-based knowledge like intangible heritage and memory work can lead to sort of tangible policy outcomes and better urban outcomes for communities. And so the question, I guess, is with this distinction between like cultural planning and heritage planning, is it worth sort of directing this advocacy at the heritage sector and trying to overhaul the Ontario Heritage Act and trying to include, you know, economic, social, and finance levers within the Ontario Heritage Act? Or is it sort of time to say, okay, that's a relic of the past, let's really decentralize this, look at all of the sort of different levers and try to incorporate heritage into all of that? I'm curious if we lose anything by sort of not having it under the umbrella of heritage anymore.
That's a very good question. I think internationally, heritage still has a value. Like UNESCO, the issue of intangible heritage at an international level is really important, and it has legitimacy in all kinds of different ways. At the local level, I'm not so sure. I think it's very retardataire. It's very a bit problematic. And I think we'd be, in the short term, I think we'd be wise to think more about culture, which connects to all these other areas like dance and music and all these, which are also challenged by the same kind of issues. And so I think rolling it into a kind of cultural discussion would be, I think, strategically very helpful. But I've listened to other people.
My response would be all of it. I think we should advocate in cultural planning. I think we should advocate in heritage planning. I think a lot of the times we kind of, so for example, the City of Toronto's cultural plan, some of the engagement involved like DIY cultural planning. So you could kind of, as a community member, download a bunch of forms and kind of facilitate a conversation. And I think that's moving in the right direction. I don't know who ended up participating and taking on the charge, but I think to me, sometimes it's all semantics. Like all of this stuff is just tools that we can use to kind of make sure that our culture is not disappearing in the ways that we know it. And so yeah, advocacy everywhere.
Could I say also vote? Vote.
I was just going to pick up on one idea, and that is in the existing development processes, heritage is part of that. And so from an Indigenous perspective, it's the only door that Indigenous heritage can walk through. And so it is the way in to the conversations at a practical project level. Otherwise, and even then, it's often a fight both for the client and also it can be because we're working within the fairly conventional framework of heritage. It's difficult to get a little elbow room in there and to try and expand what we're talking about. But so, yeah, a little fearful of doing away with the door because right now it's our only door in. So.
I just also wanted to add, I think the Heritage Act, as I understand it, also requires an expert to be involved in documenting the value of a place. And I think that in itself is a process, because we haven't talked about process a lot today, but I think as a process in the Heritage Act, that in itself is also a barrier for communities to be able to do that work themselves. And it kind of goes back to like the idea of like relying on institutional archives, which are often colonial in the ways that they're recording property-based archives. So I think in terms of process also, we can think about advocacy at each step also in terms of how can communities come in and be a part of that process. And maybe there are experts who are working pro bono or sort of as part of that community effort to kind of document the value of places.
I would just add, I mean, I have been consulted on different properties for the music history of it, and I think that you're absolutely right that there should be a very energetic attempt to reach as wide a, going back to going back to the diversity question, to reach as wide a array of experts as possible, so that what the city and the developer are getting is a really fulsome perspective on the heritage of a property.
I think the breadth of it is a really important thing, and I like what you had said, Sneha, is just all of it. For me, reflecting on it as someone who's sort of outside of the strict disciplines of urban planning and architecture and placemaking. We were talking about the UNESCO designations. Just a couple of weeks ago, I went down the highway to Detroit, and Detroit is designated as a UNESCO City of Design. And part of that comes from this really powerful, palpably felt cultural heritage of the legacy of industry and the legacy of the automotive industry, and how that can now be channeled into different types of crafts and a different type of legacy of making and design. And one thing that you feel in a really powerful and palpable way in Detroit is the weight of the city's mythology and its cultural identity and its mythos. And, from Black Detroiters to Henry Ford, the auto industry. And something that Lisa said to me before the beginning of our panel today was that in Canada, the South tends to erase the North. We ignore so much. So we have huge parts of the country that only now, and mostly thanks to Indigenous leadership, are sort of re-entering our idea, our mental cognitive map of what Canada is. And I think even here in Toronto, growing up here most of my life, we lack an ability to self-mythologize. It's very easy for the richness of our history, from like something like the Yorkville music venues of the 1950s and 60s, to get erased, for younger generations not to know about it, for it somehow to disappear and become seemingly insignificant. There are very, very few places, I think there are very few cities in the world that would allow that to happen. So I think it's incumbent on us in a broad sense, even for those of us who might be writers or musicians or singers or whatever, there's a part for everybody to play, I think, first to just create a powerful narrative of place that we all contribute to and that we all share. And I believe, personally at least, that a sort of healthy understanding of heritage comes out of that.
Yeah, I think that's so true. I think Toronto actually, I despair at how little Toronto celebrates its greatness. I mean, we should take a page from American cities because they mythologize so well. And, you know, Toronto is every bit as great as any city in the United States, but we don't tell the world that. And it's like we almost have to convince ourselves of it. Maybe that's just the inferiority complex, you know, carrying on, you know, this idea that, well, unless someone from the States or Europe tells us we're great, we're not. We have to believe it ourselves, I think.
I was going to say, I was in Calgary recently, and I went to all the independent bookstores and looked for a book on Calgary. Like, just, so Toronto's doing really well. I'm just using it as the comparison.
By comparison,
So-
okay.
So there was one book about how to kind of hitchhike through Calgary. That was the only book. So there was no book about the history of Calgary, the architecture of Calgary, the people who live in Calgary, the evolution of Calgary. There's none of that stuff was available anywhere. So me and my buddies are working on a book on Calgary right now, because I think it is that issue of just understanding, appreciating, touting, just understanding the uniqueness of each city, and it's absolutely essential to build that, like that nest of culture, so you actually have some support in your life, right?
But yeah, I was just going to say it's similar with the film industry. Like Toronto rarely plays itself. Like that's a whole video essay. And
Yeah. There's a question there.
Oh, yeah, sure. Probably have time for one or two more comments.
I just want to say thank you to everyone, and I'm going to try to make sense of what I'm getting at, and what I'm getting at is kind of what's been touched on in certain ways too. And I guess my thread being tangible spaces for intangible heritage, perhaps, and this is kind of looking at it through the development lens of what we talked about today, since it's highly relevant and it's highly disruptive both of tangible and intangible heritage. Myself, just coming at this from perspective of a heritage consultant and a historian and someone just very passionate about the built environment, that I see in certain ways like an incomparable significance of tangible heritage. And so when I see a preserved facade, I think like, you know, there's a loss there in a sense, or there's something there, but it's a loss still. Just knowing that future generations will never be able to step foot on a hardwood floor and hear it squeaking, and thinking about the traditional histories of that with, you know, the hardware store from 100 years ago, which is kind of part of that traditional narrative of heritage, but also the music venue that it turned into, or the cultural space, or just a place where people have congregated for, just as humans in their regular, you know, meeting together to solve problems, or just to be together like we are in a space like this today. So at the same time, it can be difficult, as we touched upon today, to preserve a tangible space without diminishing a sense of the authenticity. And as we touched about today, sometimes the buildings itself aren't really what matters. You know, we love to look at all the beautiful classical detailing in this room here, but we don't need it to be here together. So to kind of wrap up my point of what I'm trying to get at is, I'm just wondering, like, in terms of the various, like the empowerment of various groups, as we have a very diverse group up here today of just different ways of pulling at this idea of intangible heritage, the role of carving out new spaces that don't necessarily need to have the preservation of heritage attributes, they don't have to have the really built aspect of it, but nonetheless, they need to, obviously, as we've seen today with the example of the music venue that was the facsimile, it's there, but it's not functional. So in this process of, I don't want to say fighting against development, because I think there's ways that compromise comes out of things, but having a sense of empowerment where these new spaces can be carved out of a development, because what we see a lot of is, say, with a condo, it turns into, a lot of these are traditionally always private spaces. I mean, a music venue has someone who's trying to make money there, just different things like that, the restaurant that someone maybe went to that people congregated at. But today with condos, there's, I think, more of that divide between public and private space than ever before. So I guess I'm kind of trying to just see here what level of engagement or what tools could be used to bring people together to come out to, say, like a public information session for a development that's going to be inevitable. It's going to happen. We can't stop these things. But how do we carve out spaces in these new buildings, say, to have new history being built off of our traditions and our intangible past coming together, to have that living heritage, I guess?
So there used to be in the city of Toronto something called Section 37 agreements, which allowed the planning department to meet with the developer and sort of say, well, if you're going to do this development, we want something in exchange for the community. That provision has been cut by the provincial government, so we're no longer able to do that. And so that was actually a very unfortunate thing that's happened. I was just thinking, when you're talking about facades being kept and the center being hollowed out, Toronto has this weird thing that's happening right now where we have many developments that have nothing but facades on the ground floor and then a step back, a tower on the top. The tower is gigantic. And a friend of mine who's from New York said, what's with this jack-in-the-box architecture? And it's interesting because, love it or hate it, a lot of architectural terms like Gothic were originally negative terms. So jack-in-the-box architecture might be a typology that we're exploring in Toronto, which exists almost nowhere else in the world. So it's what are we going to do with that? Anyway.
I would just add, Michael, you would know about this, or others will know about this, but there's a building on Yonge Street just north of College that's just been developed, the one with the clock tower. And it was a gay bar. And I think the developer is doing some kind of commemoration of the history of that in the lobby.
Yeah, we do. If you look at that now, you look at the flagpole, and it's painted with the gay flag colors. Right, so there's all kind, and there's Michael Lexier, an artist, has been commissioned to do a bunch of interpretive pieces around the piece. So this interpretation, there's kind of ways we can work with developers, especially if the developer is at all friendly or understanding, or like not all of it's like we have this polarity that we kind of divide the world, but many people are actually kind of fairly cooperative. And in fact, if there was a mechanism to sort of say you need to provide a certain amount of space, many people would be very welcoming to do that. There's just no mechanism right at the moment. So it's, but anyway, that's a cool, I think a cool example. Yeah.
All right, I'll mention one other thing, and then there's a question over here, and I know that Lisa wants to speak, but I'm wearing a T-shirt for the concert hall, which was what the Masonic Temple at Yonge and Davenport used to be. And I'll just say that the owners of that building, when they bought that building, I was like, oh my God, it's going to get torn down for condos. And the owner of that building happens to be a massive music fan. And he loved the architecture, but he also loved the music heritage. So if you go into that venue now, which he's got his offices upstairs, but he's also repurposing the auditorium as a music venue. he's commemorating the history, the music history of that building really, really well. So in some cases, if the developer is friendly or open to, you know, the culture, you know, that can be commemorated in that way. I
think I'm going to hark people's rumbling stomachs and just say maybe some last words from the panel, and then we can all enjoy a refreshing beverage and mingle out in the garden there.
I don't have anything to say. I just wanted to add, to respond to your notion, simply to say that I mentioned in my talk something what we call a cultural landscape approach, and this has been very helpful and applicable and relevant, more so in public projects than private projects, to be fair. But that approach allows you to look at things like historical patterns of use, historical uses, traditional communities who might have occupied or have some attachment or association with the place. So it's sort of a way of articulating a slightly more fulsome history and historical grounding that, if it's working well, will give you threads that you can pull through the project, and then they show up as part of the heritage conservation approach. And it's sort of like, this is how this place has been part of an ecosystem of meaning and value by various people. And so, you know, if in order to honor that, it needs to inform the new project or the new intervention that's happening. So just to say that.
Well, I don't know, like Lisa, I don't know what else to say except I'll pick up on Michael's comment about vote. I think we need change in this province and this city. And I do think that citizens can advocate for the change that's needed, and I think the more people speak up and say what is of value and of importance and worth preserving, the better chance we have of achieving that.
Yeah, that's great. I just wanted to say that I know Dane and Chi were looking forward to being here today, and I know they're great speakers, and I can't really do them justice, but I know they had a lot to say about displacement and kind of like the spirit of the places that they represent, and just the important work that's being done to ensure that a lot of this culture that we see around us, that we often take for granted, is being preserved. So if you have the opportunity, I'd really encourage you to kind of listen to one of their talks at some point in the future.
One thing that I take some comfort in living here and in my daily life is that we have opportunities such as this symposium today to sort of discuss the meaning of intangible heritage and culture in a formal way. But then in a minute or two, we're going to get off this stage and we're going to have a cup of coffee and something to eat, and we're going to continue discussing it in an informal way. And that counts too. That's still the creation of culture. And then after that, we're all going to disperse and go out into the city. And on the bus or the streetcar, on the way home, in the coffee shop, we continue it. And then we go home with our loved ones and out into the world. So in everything that we do, I think the creation of culture is something that doesn't have boundaries. So it's just as each of us playing our role, having these conversations in whatever part of whatever venue we have, I think is part of the bigger story. That's all there really is to it. So, you know, as a non-professional, as just a guy writing about this stuff, that's how I try to approach it in my life.
It's hard to follow that. I think for me, maybe I'll end with a personal reflection that came up in response to your question as well. I think for me, when I started my research, I kind of had a little bit of a bias towards downtown because that's always where I've lived. And so I went in being like, how can we bring these banquet halls to downtown? And part of that was, how do we negotiate with developers? And soon I learned that actually their location in these suburban areas is what makes them special in some ways, because, for example, For a lot of Indian weddings, there's a processional element that leads up to the wedding, and for that, these big parking lots are actually the site. So in India, when a wedding happens, there's a procession that happens, specifically in Hindu weddings, from the groom's house to the bride's house, and that happens on the streets. And in the GTA, the sort of substitute for that is the parking lot. And without, like, I went in with certain biases and assumptions, and very quickly that was challenged, and the folks that I spoke to, every single banquet hall owner was very happy with the location of their space. And so I think for me, and even today in this conversation, just thinking about how we want to make sure we're not sort of bringing our biases to when we start doing this research around culture, because that is such a big part of it, is that every person's culture is different, and it's a mix of different things, and that kind of translates to how we document it, how we write about it. Yeah.
Well, those are all great comments. Hard to follow. I think I would simply sort of say that Toronto is this unique place. It's a unique opportunity. You read the newspapers these days, and the world is really messed up, and if we're the top point, we've got to be really on our toes. I think we need to demonstrate. We have a responsibility to demonstrate the diversity of our city and to make it really work fantastically as a model for other communities, because there's a lot that needs to be addressed in the world. And I think our connection to groups like UNESCO and ICOMOS, and those groups are really important. To understand this issue of intangible heritage is really important, and to understand it in a political way. We need to think politically and strategically. Thank you.
Wow, that was a tour de force, and I just really want to thank all of you for a beautiful and nuanced piece of thought leadership here today. Just give them a big round of applause. On behalf of the Architectural Conservancy of Ontario, Toronto, I just want to thank, of course, our speakers and moderators, but also all of our staff and volunteer and everyone at CECIL Center. We've got food for you. We've got bubbly water. We got alcoholic drinks for purchase. You can get drink tickets over in the pamphlet station at the back there, and then the bar is right here. And please enjoy the courtyard. The weather looks like it might still be warm, even though the sun went in. Thank you all so much for coming, and enjoy the rest of your day.